So, the economy hasn't been great at basically any point in my life. And if you're anything like me, you've probably got some kind of fantasy in your head. Some kind of perfect robbery you could pull off. And it just gets a little more ridiculous and a little more out there every time your job somehow gets more boring than it was yesterday. For most people, those schemes just stay in our heads and we never go anywhere with them because they're ridiculous. But for Philip Arnold and John Slack, a couple of ridiculously lucky guys from the 1800s, it was more than a fantasy. So the main character in this story is Philip Arnold, who's a Mexican war vet who moved to California after the war and became a prospector. He struck it rich as a prospector, and he was able to buy a farm in Kentucky not long after the war and started a family there. And farm life treated him well, but by 1870 he had heard some news that got him and his cousin John Slack back to prospecting. See, around that time a bunch of Americans were profiting heavily from South African diamond mines, and Arnold wanted in. So he and his cousin John Slack decided they were going to join forces and buy themselves a diamond mine in South Africa. There was just one slight problem. Turns out going to South Africa and finding an unclaimed diamond mine is really hard. Looking back on his time as a prospector, Philip thought to himself, well, maybe we could find a diamond mine in America. They couldn't. But he wasn't ready to let this scheme go, especially when he worked for the Diamond Drill Company, of all things. He bought some uncut diamonds from that company for about $1,500, then went out to Arizona to purchase some uncut rubies and sapphires. Then he put them all in a big sack together and got to work. Philip and John Slack presented their sack to George Roberts, a businessman who is kind of well known for making rash decisions. He was immediately interested, and like any self-respecting lower-rung victim of a pyramid scheme, he immediately invited a couple of his buddies to join him. Namely William Ralston, the head of the Bank of California, and Asbury Harpending, who used to work as a pirate for the Confederate States of America. Everything was going smoothly, they got 3 potential investors, and they all seemed to be falling for it. But then, something happened. Thinking there was a chance the diamonds might be fake, Ralston wanted to send them off to get appraised. No big deal, right? They're all real. But he was sending them off to Charles Tiffany, founder of Tiffany's Jewelry, a man who would most certainly be aware that diamonds, rubies, and sapphires don't naturally occur in the same places and tell the investors as much. This is what we in the business like to call a worst-case scenario, and in a sane world, it's probably where this story would have ended. But Tiffany, who works with jewels for a living, apparently didn't know that. In fact, not only did he say that it was totally legit, for some reason he appraised the sack of jewels at $150,000. So now, the 3 investors were officially in. But they weren't ready to invest yet. First, they had to see the place these gems had come from, so Arnold and Slack went over to England, bought $20,000 worth of gems, and then sprinkled them around throughout a patch of dirt on the Colorado and Wyoming border. And June 4th, 1872 was the moment of truth. Arnold, Slack, and the investors went out to the field with a mining engineer. The engineer took one look at the land and said, "Yep, that's real." So the investors bought in, none of them any the wiser. They purchased the land for $600,000, which is about $10 million today, and in a hilarious twist of fate, they then founded a company, turned around, and asked other people to invest in their newly purchased and totally legit mine. Not long after that, the mining engineer happened to meet Clarence King on a train. Clarence King, if you can believe it, was the very first head of the USGS. So naturally, the engineer told King all about the find, but King wasn't buying it. He didn't think his team could have missed something like that while they were out in that area, but more importantly, he immediately recognized that diamonds, rubies, and sapphires don't naturally occur in the same place. So after fooling a mining engineer and one of the most famous jewelers in the country, our boys were only taken down by the final boss of guys who should have known better. Clarence King went out to the mine and pretty quickly discovered that there weren't any diamonds more than a few feet down into the dirt. News spread quick, and Arnold and Slack found themselves on the wrong end of a lawsuit. They only ended up having to pay $150,000 out of the $600,000 they'd made, so they still walked away with a fortune. And they used that fortune well, especially Arnold, who became a banker and lived a decent life until 1878, when he was shot down in a gunfight with a rival banker and died of pneumonia while recovering.